KZSU-FM Stanford. Welcome to another edition of Hearsay Culture on the Hearsay Culture Network. My name is Dave Levine. I'm a professor at Elon University School of Law, as well as an affiliate scholar for years and years at this point at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School, as well as currently affiliated with the University of Milan's Information Society Law Center and the University of North Carolina's Center for Information Technology and Public Life. Today, we are diving into a topic which we have come back to from time to time over the 18-year history of hearsay culture, which are questions involving speech and its limits, information in society and how we consume it, and what democracies actually do. And one of the leading books in this space right now, exceptionally timely, is by our guest today, Barbara McQuade. The book is Attack from Within: How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. Barbara is a former prosecutor, also a regular contributor on MSNBC. And so that is where I actually came across her initially, even though she is also a law professor, which just goes to show that not every law professor knows every other law professor. But in her book, she goes through a fascinating history of disinformation, but then also I think identifies every conceivable harm that might come out of this information, from societal to government to individual. And so in this lengthy book, Barbara traces how disinformation is currently operating in 2024 in the United States, what its antecedents are, where it manifests itself, and then in closing, what we might do about it. Now, most books that and authors that I have on the show, I can't possibly cover even half of what's in the book, maybe a third. But the amount of material and information, which is a positive in this book, means that we'll probably cover about 20%. And then, of course, you're dealing with a law professor talking to a prosecutor and law professor. And so we're going to dive into some law as well. So we're going to cover some of the questions of what disinformation is, how it manifests itself, some interesting observations that Barbara makes. We're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, and what that means for platforms, how technology plays a role here. And then, because there is optimism in notwithstanding the title Attack from Within, what we might actually do about these issues. So very excited to have Barbara on the show today. Barbara is a professor from practice at the University of Michigan Law School, her alma mater, where she teaches courses in criminal law, criminal procedure, national security, and data privacy. She's, again, been on MSNBC and also for NBC News. She's a co-host of the podcast Sisters-in-Law, so it's always fun to have a fellow podcaster on the show. She served from 2010 to 2017 as a U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of Michigan. She was appointed by President Barack Obama and was the first woman to serve in her position. She's joining us via Zoom today on August 26, 2024. Barbara, thank you for joining us on the Hearsay Culture Network.
Well, thanks, Dave. I'm really happy to be with you.
So let's start right in. I'm gonna do the lawyer question. We're gonna define some terms. I have some definitions. Others have definitions. How do you define disinformation?
Well, I in the book, use the word disinformation to mean deliberately false claims designed to deceive people to advance some sort of agenda.
Yeah. And when we talk about, and let's go through each word, when we're talking about deliberate, right, as lawyers, we're talking about not an accident, but we're also talking about intentionality. Now, we might be losing listeners already. This is not just for lawyers, folks. This is for everyone. But I think I'm right about this. When we talk about someone having an intention to do something, right? What does that mean in the context of disinformation?
So, in the law, we talk about things from whether it's purposeful, knowing, reckless, or merely negligent. And so when it is intentional, it is a deliberate effort. I am sharing with you information I know to be false because I want to manipulate individuals or groups in society. That's in contrast to misinformation. Now, some people use the terms interchangeably, and maybe that's correct, but in my book, I want to define the two differently because they do have different levels of intent. Misinformation, as I define it, is an unwitting sharing of false information. So I read
Mhm.
something about COVID vaccines or a stolen election or whatever it is, and I share it with others because I believe it to be true. In some ways, I am an unwitting ally and co-conspirator with those who are sharing these things, but I do it in an innocent way. But because of the nature of social media and hearsay in society, it's very easy for a false claim to spin out of control because of people who repeat claims they believe to be true when they are false.
And so it's really interesting to think about it this way. And I want to set this term properly because it frames our entire discussion today. Dan Fallis wrote an article called "What is Disinformation" in 2015, where he ultimately, and it's a brilliant article that I recommend to my listeners, as I recommend your book. He talks about disinformation as non-accidentally misleading information, which is not much different than what you're saying here. But he makes a point that I want to ask you about. He says, why do we use that definition? And he points out, I'm just quoting him, focusing on non-accidentally misleading information puts us in a better position to detect this specific type of misleading information. For instance, he writes, much like lie detection techniques, we can look for the information to mislead instead of just looking for errors. And so that difference that you just pointed out, right, between misinformation and disinformation seems very critical. And so I want to ask you the question this way. Misinformation, right, has intentionality to some degree, except it's a mistake. And so you could say, well, you're sharing information, but you didn't know that it was false, for example. Whereas disinformation is intentionally misleading, right? And my question as a practical matter before we dive in is, does it make a difference whether the information is misleading, right, or misinformation versus disinformation?
Well, the effect on the listener may be the same. If somebody
Mhm.
repeats a claim, with some quack remedy for COVID-19 and someone hears about it, I suppose it doesn't matter whether the speaker was intentional or unintentional. But I
Mhm.
think in terms of, bad actors and who is polluting our information ecosphere, it is the disinformers. And, the people who are sharing misinformation are just sort of unwitting dupes. I'll give you
Mhm.
an example. When I
Mhm.
myself, believe it or
Yeah.
not, Dave, I myself was one of these unwitting dupes, as most of us have been.
I'm about to say, name someone who hasn't been on the internet who hasn't been
Yeah,
misinformation. Yeah,
it's easy to fall for it. I
yeah,
read something online that said Patrick Mahomes, the NFL star quarterback, had made an announcement that he was not going to play another down for the Kansas City Chiefs
hmm
until
hmm
they changed their name to something that was not offensive to Native Americans.
hmm
I
hmm
read that. I thought, good for him, standing up for a cause, sacrificing millions. And I, passed that on. I
Yeah.
reposted that. And only later did I realize it was fake and
Wow.
took it
Yep.
down. But, why do people post some of these things? Some are to advance an agenda, a political candidate, a political party, a profit motive. And some of it is simply to stoke division in society. And
hmm
so, this is one that is certainly, something about traditional sports teams' names versus, respect or disrespect to Native American groups. This is one of these hot button divisive issues in society. And so,
Yeah.
by failing to be a critical consumer of news, I pass that on. And, in response, people start saying, good for him, or, he's just woke. This is what's wrong with American society, and all kinds of things like that. So
Yeah.
I think it does matter if we are going to try to address the problem of disinformation, because going after some of these intentional abuses of the ability to share information, I think is requires us to understand what motivates people to send these false claims. And
hmm
when it's innocent, it's one thing, and when it's deliberate, it's something quite different.
Well, and we're chatting with Barbara McQuade, author of the book "Attack from Within" on KZSU-FM Stanford. I mean that's what makes it so pernicious, perhaps, right? I mean, people have been making mistakes with information since time immemorial, right? I mean, whether you believe in God or not, right? The Bible, the original stories, at least that many people follow, have all kinds of mistakes that human beings are making, all right? And then we go right up to the present day where we have both misinformation and disinformation. Perhaps the difference here, as reflected in your title, is that you're talking about this as an attack, right? As an attack, which also has a lot of intentionality tied to it, although again, attacks can be accidental. What is this attack specifically that you're identifying from within?
Yeah, so I have a background as a national security prosecutor. I teach a course in national security law at Michigan Law School. And one of the topics that has gained more and more space on my syllabus in recent years is this idea of information warfare. It
Mhm.
is a weapon designed to disrupt and destabilize democracies. And so originally in my class, starting in 2017, 2018, I was writing about, teaching about Russia, how
Mhm.
Russia was bombarding us with false claims in an effort to influence our elections or undermine our confidence in democracy or just to stoke division in society. So it was very much an attack from hostile foreign adversaries. But
Mhm.
in recent years, it seems to me that we are seeing these kinds of attacks from within our own country. So, certainly, regardless of your politics, whether you're conservative, liberal, anywhere in between, we have certainly seen, I think, disinformation pushed out into the news media by Donald Trump.
Mhm.
Whether it's about a crowd size or whether artificial intelligence was used to create a crowd
Mhm.
at a rally. It is an effort to both mislead people and to undermine our confidence in the truth.
Mhm.
So you may or may not believe this claim that is put out there. Some people may, right? Stop the Steal was an effort to convince people that an election had been stolen. But when you talk about things like AI generated that picture, some of that is designed just to make you question reality, and
Yeah.
throw up your hands and say, I don't know what to believe. I don't know if any of it's true. And that enables people who propagate false information to be able to call everything they don't like fake news.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
and so it causes good people, I think, to become cynical and disengage from politics altogether and say, I don't know what to believe. They're all a bunch of crooks. And so I'm just going to go about my life and not worry about politics. And that's really, damaging to democracy.
When we talk about this kind of attack, right? I mean, even the most powerful office in the land, right, has limited power to attack information, right, and information ecosystems. And so when we talk about this machinery, as it were, of this attack, as your book lays out, right? It's more than just the former president, right, who obviously is saying all kinds of things which are just flat out false, right, for a variety of motivations that we probably will never fully glean, right? But it requires news media to report it. It requires technology to share it. It requires people that consume it. And so when you think about it, I'm asking, when you think about this attack, and you talk about this in the book, where are the levers of the attack? Obviously, we could say it starts with the speaker, but it's
Yeah.
much more than that, isn't it?
Well, sure. So, it starts with the speaker, but then there are also enablers. I think a big part of the problem is in our deeply polarized society, we care more about tribe than we care about truth. And I'll give you an example from the left.
Mhm.
Very recently there has been this running joke about JD Vance and a couch, which
Yeah,
is 100% false,
right.
completely fabricated joke. And yet
Hmm.
we constantly are hearing Democratic politicians making reference to it. Tim Walz, I'd like to challenge JD Vance to a debate if he'll get up off his couch. And just at the Democratic convention, Elizabeth Warren saying something like, I wouldn't trust him to move my couch. I mean, come on. They're
Yeah, yeah.
pushing this theme. Now, it's sort of like I'm in on this joke. I'm part of this tribe, and people laugh and pile on. And so I think that in addition to the speaker, there are enablers who care more about the tribe than they do about the truth. So I think that is one inner ring of people who push disinformation. But then even going broader than that, there are the social media platforms, the mass media platforms, traditional legacy media who do allow themselves to be used for these kinds of things. And I think as long as they're making a profit, they're not too unhappy about it and not willing to make any changes. The mainstream media, legacy media, will say, well, we're just reporting the news. For example, there was a joke going around after Nancy Pelosi's husband was brutally attacked in
Right.
their home by an
Yep.
intruder with a hammer. There were rumors speculating as to the relationship that Paul Pelosi had with this intruder. Again, completely fabricated. And yet we saw Donald Trump Jr. and others making jokes about that. And then the mass media reporting it, not that it's true, but that Donald Trump Jr. said this thing.
Right.
And so,
Right.
and
Right.
they say, well, that's news that he said this, incredibly crass and completely lacking in empathy comment. Well, a lot of people will read that headline quickly, and maybe they catch the gist that they're just reporting that he said this thing that was untrue, or maybe they just get the gist of it and think the thing was true. So
Right.
there's
Right.
that contribution to it. And then, of course, there's social media, which, through its algorithms and through its anonymity, through its ability for anybody to say anything at lightning speed, through the ability of bots online to amplify false claims, really makes it very easy to reach many people quickly with false claims and be deceptive. And yet we see the big tech industry really pushing back against any kind of regulation that might be able to rein that in.
I do want to come back in the second half of our show to some of the regulatory issues involving technology. But I'm glad, Robert, that you brought up this again, right? False story about J.D. Vance. And I'm using the word false very specifically because we're seeing a lot of reticence, first of all, in calling out what is false. Now, we could talk later about, and we're, about what is a fact and so forth. We're not going to get that theoretical. But going with that example, I was just reading yesterday in preparation for our discussion today that during the Democratic National Convention last week, while I believe it was Katie Tur on MSNBC was broadcasting on the floor, or at least in the convention center, a random person who was attending the DNC walked up behind her for about 10 or so seconds and held up a sign making reference to with language that the SEC would prohibit on the air. Right, this particular behavior. Now the clip, and I wasn't watching live, but like everything else, it's shared. The clip is about 15 seconds. It's unclear whether Tur certainly was aware of it. But here's my question for you. Right, we know nothing about this particular person who held up the sign. We don't know, for all we know, right? This individual thinks it's true or thinks it's false, right? We could guess what the motivations are. That's probably not too hard to guess, right? And to theorize on. But the question is what we do about it, right? What we do about it. Is that the kind of attack that we should be concerned about? And I want to be clear about this. The attack being individual holds up like a sign. It was like a placard, right? With this statement on it, we know it as much as one can know. We know it's false. It's been debunked, right? Is that the kind of attack we should be worried about here? This individual holding up the sign, or is it a more pernicious or more pronounced concern that you have with regard to what these attacks are?
Well, I think that's a small scale example of it.
Mhm.
It's probably more worrisome when it's coming from the president of the United States than some rando on the floor of the
Right,
convention. But
right,
nonetheless, I think that we and the media and others who have the power to correct falsehoods
right.
should do so. It may have been impossible to avoid having this person, run up with the sign, but I don't know what the position was at the time, but I
Yep.
think a responsible journalist would say, the message that was just posted behind me, of course, has no basis in fact.
Mhm. Mhm.
I think would be a responsible way to handle something like that.
Yeah, and to be absolutely clear, I mean, as a individual viewer, it was not clear to me that that Katie Tur had any idea it was going
Yeah,
on, right? And so, but to be more specific about the question, I guess what I'm asking is this, right? It's on the floor of the Democratic National Convention, even though it's a random person. It's obviously national media, right? And here's the point: people say all kinds of things. They hold up signs, they make jokes. For all we know, he thinks it's like you said earlier, he's in on a joke. It's not really true. But of course, to the viewer, right, they may not have any idea what the truth is in this scenario. And so is that an attack, right, using that word, or is that something different than the kinds of disinformation that really concerns you?
yeah. This kind of example reminds me of the kind of thing, if you ever watch, college football game day, you'll
Hmm.
see people holding up signs that everybody knows is a joke. If
Right,
it's the opposing coach, it's, coach so and so wears ladies' underwear. I don't know,
right, right,
whatever
right, right.
the joke of the day is. And I think
Hmm.
everybody understands in that context that these are just jokes. I mean, I suppose the same from the random person who holds up the sign, on the convention floor.
Hmm.
But I think to the extent that there is a running joke that people are concerned about, I think responsible news people have a responsibility to correct them. And this business about the couch is one thing, but
Hmm.
um, I cite it only as an example that although I think the far right has been the most responsible for disinformation in recent years, everybody has the power to use it, and once unleashed, it is a very powerful weapon.
Hmm.
And one would hope that responsible media outlets would do their best to make it clear that what it's broadcasting is or is not a parody, satire, joke, or legitimate claim.
Right. And again, on hearsay culture, one of the things we focus on is we don't want people guessing the facts. You shouldn't have to guess the facts. We need to be able to do more with that. You talk in the book about a third aspect of this, right? We've talked a little bit about misinformation. We talked about disinformation, but you also talk about something which I think is very important, which is manipulation, right? The act of manipulating other people's thoughts, feelings, actions, and so forth, which is a theme that runs through the entire book. And to me, which again, we can't cover all of it, virtually every harm that you identify in the book involving disinformation, right, involves manipulating human actions, human thoughts, human behaviors. Talk to me a little bit more about manipulation in the
Yeah.
context of this attack.
Well, and this is why, the book is about disinformation and not
Hmm.
just lies. I mean,
Hmm.
lies are one thing, but disinformation is something else. It comes from the intelligence community, and
Hmm.
it is, psyop, sometimes people call it.
Right.
It is an effort to push people to have an emotional reaction and response to information that you are sharing with them. So, some examples of it: declinism, convincing people that our society is going downhill. Hitler used this after World War One, and then Donald Trump talked about American carnage and how the crime rate is rampant, when in fact crime has been going down steadily in the
Right.
past several years.
Right.
Really working on people's emotions. Fear is another powerful manipulator. Look, you should be afraid of immigrants. You should be afraid of crime. Vote for me, and I'll keep you safe. We should be afraid of other
Hmm.
people. Even these references where they mispronounce Kamala Harris's name,
Right.
Kamala and Kamala.
Yeah.
David Perdue in Georgia, joked about Kamala Malala. Who
Yeah.
knows how to say it? It is an
Right.
effort to sort of other her. And
Yeah.
remember, she's not, one of us. She's different. And so it really appeals to these, base instincts that people may not really even be thinking about at an intellectual level, but really trying to appeal to fear, protectionism, this idea of the great replacement theory of society. People are coming to take what's yours. There's a lot of that goes on in some of this messaging. And so some of those tactics, as I mentioned, were uh, declinism, but just repetition. If I say things enough times, I can convince you that it's true.
Hmm.
Stop the steal, lock her up, drain the swamp. You hear those things enough, and you begin to believe the narratives are true.
Right.
I cite some examples in my book where people say, well, how could it not be true that the election was stolen? I hear it from so many different sources.
Right. Right.
Because there's a lot of people repeating something that they
Mhm.
heard to be true. So, manipulating people's emotions, making them feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. It reminds me of some of the work I did in countering violent extremism.
Yeah.
There were terrorist recruiters online who would recruit people with these ideas of, somebody is trying to make the world a warped place and it's up to you to change it and make it better. It's appealing to emotions. And that is something that is, I think, one of the real dangers of disinformation.
You mentioned, and we're chatting with Barbara McQuade, author of the book Attack from Within: How Disinformation is Sabotaging America, on KZSU-FM, Stanford, and Hearsay Culture. You talk about your background as a prosecutor, which, as a law professor, I would be negligent if I didn't discuss it, particularly since law students do listen to the show. You talk in the book also about something very interesting, which is how in practice you saw people really wanted to hear things that aligned with what they believed or wanted to be true. And I am a former civil litigator, and so I saw some of that as well. But I think it's much more pronounced generally speaking, in criminal law. Can you talk a little bit about that? How not only generally how your experience as a prosecutor informs this work, but also specifically, that general idea of, boy, I really like being told that what I thought was right.
Yeah. No, there's this idea of confirmation bias
Hmm.
and cognitive dissonance, two cognitive forces that really enable disinformation. So confirmation bias is what causes me to believe the facts that are consistent with my worldview and to ignore the facts that are inconsistent with my worldview. It's one of the things that, as prosecutors investigating crimes, are taught to avoid, because if you investigate a crime with an end in mind, you will
Hmm.
tend to focus on all the things that support your thesis and ignore all of the things that refute it. So I cite in the
Hmm.
book an example of a terrorism investigation where investigators had a theory because they had a fingerprint match with a lawyer in Oregon uh, as being involved in a terrorist attack in Europe.
Hmm.
And so as they investigated, they looked at all of these facts and built out a case to support their case against him. But in fact, they had ignored a lot of probably even more important facts that cut against their thesis. And ultimately, they cleared him and dismissed the charges, but only after causing great disruption in this person's life and a lot of embarrassment for the law enforcement organizations. That's an example of confirmation bias. But I'll also tell you about cognitive dissonance, which is
Hmm.
we want our belief to be consistent with the information that we're seeing and the messenger who's giving it to us. And if
Right.
there's anything about that that doesn't fit, it really disrupts our mindset. If I like a particular political candidate, I hear what that person has to say. I want that all to be consistent with my worldview. And an example of that came when we prosecuted in my former office a cancer doctor who had lied to his patients about having cancer so
Hmm.
that he could administer expensive chemotherapy treatments to them and bill Medicare, which he did to the tune of millions of dollars.
Yeah.
And then after years of treatment, he would tell them that he cured them and they no longer had cancer. Well, it's
Yeah.
easy to cure somebody if they never had cancer in the first place. So he was
Right.
this really successful cancer doctor. And when the case first was charged, many of his former patients had a hard time believing it was true. They would
Yeah.
say, "No, it's ridiculous. He is my savior. He saved my life. He's a brilliant doctor." And it took a lot of them a long time to believe that he had done this to them. Many victims of fraud, I have found, are often reluctant to believe the truth because I think some of it is a refusal to believe you've been duped.
Right. Right.
Put your trust in this person. How could they possibly have lied about something so fundamental? And I think sometimes we're even embarrassed that we were fooled by
Hmm.
someone and that we ignored all of these warning signs. But the cumulative result of all of these things is when
Hmm.
someone tells us something that we want to believe, we
Right.
are willing to listen and believe that it's true. And that can be a very dangerous place. We need to be a little more skeptical when people appeal to, especially to our vanity.
At the same time, and actually, let me quickly say, you're listening to KZSU-FM Stanford, which is a nonprofit, non-commercial radio station at Stanford University that requires donations from listeners like you to continue its diverse programming. Email us at donate@kzsu.stanford.edu if you would like to make a contribution. Barbara, I want to turn to law, but before we do that, right? The flip side of cognitive dissonance, however, might be the knowing or willful dupe, as it were, almost like, and criminal law is your area, not mine, but I'm thinking of like willful blindness, right?
Yeah,
The
sure.
idea that, I don't want to see it, I'm not going to see it, and I'm just going to think what I'm going to think. I think about that a lot when I look at the disinformation society that we have now. And I'll give a very quick example. A person will remain nameless, but someone who is well versed in the law, said to me back in 2016, knowing what our former president was. And I said, how could you vote for someone, who, I remember this is 2016, who already was, we knew a lot about him. I'll just leave it there. And the response was, look, I'm willing to pay a lot for conservative judges. In other words, and the point being,
Yes.
I'm willing to go along with all, even if I know it's a lie,
Yep.
right? Or, I'm willing to go along because, in this person's view, it's transactional, right? It's transactional. That's what it is, and I'll go with it because I get my outcome. Is it fair to say that this goes back to what I was asking earlier, but in a different way, right? Is it fair to say that a lot of the misinformation or disinformation problems we have are a lot of it's on us? And I don't just mean we should do a better job in figuring out what's true, which I want to talk about later, but also that people are, for lack of a better phrase, going along with the joke.
Yeah, yeah, or going along with the con for
Yeah,
sure.
right.
Your friend at least was honest about it, right? I mean,
Hmm.
there are people who will say, "Yeah, I think Donald Trump is despicable, but I
Yeah,
care more about my pocketbook, and his tax cuts are good for my corporate interests or whatever it is,
right.
or I care more about a conservative court than any other issue, and so
Hmm.
I'm willing to tolerate all of the other things that a Trump presidency brings." At least those people are being honest.
Yeah,
But I
right.
think the ones that offend me the most are the people who do go along with the con, even though they know better.
Hmm.
We had some senators during the 2020 election who refused to certify the outcome of the election because, for allegations of fraud, long after, 61 courts had decided that there was no fraud,
Hmm.
because it was in their own political best interest to do that. Like, I don't know, maybe there's some fraud here.
Right,
So
right,
I do
right.
think that that's what I refer to as choosing tribe over truth. That
Hmm.
I care more about the political outcome, and I don't care about truth. I think a really good example of this, of someone I admire on her stance on this, was Liz Cheney.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
she said we can't abandon truth and remain a free country, and she
Right.
paid a great political price for standing up for truth when many people in her party would not do that, by participating in the committee to investigate the January 6th attacks and being a very
Hmm.
outspoken critic of Donald Trump. But I think it takes, a lot of political courage to do that. And I think we have a lot of people who are willing to go along with the con to advance either a political agenda, or I think most often their own political career.
Hmm.
And that to me is a very unpatriotic stance. I think
Yeah.
fidelity to truth is part of being a patriot.
So if all of this is true, right, and we don't have any empirical data on it, I guess my question for you is, what is your instinct on how much of what's going on in terms of all the damage that misinformation can have? And let's just use the one that I think is easiest for listeners to identify, which is the basic idea of lots of false information was put out there that led to the election of, right, the former president. Or a more recent example might be lots of misinformation was out there about the COVID-19 pandemic that caused people to not get vaccinated. I'll just
Yeah.
leave the two. I'm using those. There are many examples, but I'm using those as most relatable. How much of society do you think is being fooled, all right, or being truly misled versus right, either going along with it or simply, right, deciding in a transactional way, I'm going to do what I'm going to do, regardless of whether I think it's true or not.
Yeah, I don't know how the numbers break down, but I think
Mhm.
there are components of both.
Mhm.
If you look at the January 6th attack, for example, they put people, before Congress who testified and said, I bought into that thing hook, line, and sinker. And I believed it was my patriotic duty to show up there on January 6th and try to
Yeah.
prevent this stolen election from happening. So
Mhm.
there were certainly people who bought in hook, line, and sinker. And then I think there were plenty of others, who were willing to go along with the con, that this is good for
Mhm.
my party. So I'm just going to kind of perpetuate this idea that the election was stolen and hope for the best. But, we saw enough people stand up for what was right to stop that from happening. So I don't have a good sense of what the numbers are,
Mhm.
but I think there's a little bit of both. And I think
Yeah.
both are problematic for different reasons. But I fault those who know better and go
Yeah.
along with the con. I mean, those who are duped are really victims as much as anything else.
Right. So Barbara, let's turn a little bit to some of the policy and legal quandaries that exist here. And of course, standing in the way of solutions like, right, we're going to prosecute you because you didn't tell the truth, right? We're gonna. I'm not talking. By the way, I'm not talking about in trials. I'm just saying generally, right? You're allowed to lie in a lot of circumstances, right? We're going to make it so that you can't say that if we don't agree. Of course, the United States is the general concept of free speech and the more specific, right, First Amendment, which, and I don't want to get into the weeds either, but listeners need to understand that the First Amendment does not apply to speech platforms like Facebook, X, and Twitter, and so forth. They apply to, they don't apply to private entities. And again, I don't want to get too far in the weeds there, but, right, the question becomes, right, standing in the way of a lot of the regulation in this space, of course, is the basic concept of free speech. How much of a problem is free speech or the principle of free speech in addressing this attack?
Well, I think free speech is a great thing. And I think the First Amendment is a cherished right for good reason. It is what
Mhm.
allows us to speak out against our government. And so
Mhm.
I wouldn't want to do anything that runs afoul of free speech. I think mostly free speech stands as an excuse for some of what we see in terms of disinformation. The proposals I would make in an effort to mitigate disinformation online are less about content regulation, saying
Mhm.
you can't say X or you can't say Y, and more about process,
Mhm.
labeling of disinformation or of memes generated with artificial intelligence,
Mhm.
of the algorithms, of the data privacy that is scraped off of the platforms. I think that's where we can make some real inroads without um, harming our right to free speech, because it is an important right. And I don't think I want anybody policing, what you can and can't say other than laws that already exist, right? I mean, I think sometimes social media platforms and others will call anything that might regulate social media censorship. This
Mhm.
is censorship. You want to stop my free speech. Of
Mhm.
course, the law does recognize in those situations that pass strict scrutiny, and that
Mhm.
is a limitation that is narrowly tailored to achieve a compelling governmental interest, complies with the First Amendment. And that's what the Supreme Court has held. So, for example, we can criminalize threats to kill
Mhm.
somebody because it is so bad to have that out there that we're willing to have limitations on free speech when you're communicating a threat to kill somebody.
Mhm.
Perjury in the courtroom, illegal. Speaking and trying to induce people to be defrauded is a crime.
Mhm.
Agreeing to a criminal scheme is the crime of conspiracy. So there are some limitations on free speech when they are narrowly tailored to achieve a compelling governmental interest. So there may be some things we should be doing in that regard. But as I said, I'm more focused on process than on content. And I think that's the place to start with regulation online.
Although, right, lots of people want to go right after the content itself, right?
Yeah.
And so I want to talk about that and circle back. You brought up the algorithms, which of course I want to discuss. I had on the show a couple of weeks ago Annalee Newitz, who's written a terrific book with which you might be familiar called Stories or Weapons, right? Which talks about psyops and those kinds of things. And over the last 18 years, I mean, I don't know, I'd say probably a third of my guests discuss code and algorithms and technology because that's a focus of Hearsay Culture. But this theme of manipulation keeps running through the book, and I want to is something you wrote in a book which I find interesting. I want to ask you about. You said algorithms make virtual space different from public space. In the online world, you write, algorithms are often used to manipulate people to spend more time on a social media platform by feeding them content that produces strong emotions. Now, literally a couple of weeks ago, I also had Jeff Horowitz on the show, right, who wrote Broken Code, right, which is, he was the
Yeah,
Wall
yeah,
Street,
sure. Yeah, I
so
read that, and terrific book. Yeah.
with terrific book, and of course my listeners know that Jeff broke the story because he had a connection with Frances Haugen at Facebook. So a giant issue is the role of social media, and then we have Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which many of my listeners, but not all, would know. Section 230 Communications Decency Act, in most circumstances, allows social media platforms like Facebook, like X, and so forth to publish information that is even defamatory. In other words, it's not true, right? Without being liable. There are exceptions to it, but as a general matter, that is what Section 230 does. And as you write in the book, Barbara, Section 230 is credited, and I think fairly credited with the rise of social media because these companies did not have the same liability that, let's say, print newspapers would have for the same kind of content. They were able to flourish. And I want to ask you about Section 230's role, and really more broadly, the law's role, right, in allowing false information, misinformation, disinformation to flourish.
Yeah. So, of course, as you know, Section 230, just for your listeners, is sometimes referred to as the 26 words that invented the internet or
Right.
created the internet. And it essentially gives immunity from legal liability to internet service providers for content placed there. So, in other words, they're just providing the soapbox. If somebody gets up and says something defamatory or something threatening, you can go after the speaker, but not the people who put out the soapbox. They're just providing the soapbox. And so in the same way, X or Facebook or Threads or Instagram or any of these kinds of things are really just putting out the soapbox in today's technology. And in theory, that's a great thing. The idea in 1996 when that law was passed was to foster innovation, creativity, investment in internet service providers, and it happened, and here we are. And maybe that was the right law in 1996, but I don't know that that's the right law in 2024. What is that? Almost 30 years later.
Right.
It's sort of like raising a baby alligator in your bathtub. It's adorable when it's little, and then at some point it grows into a man-eating predator. You got to do something different.
Right. It's a good now. It's an interesting analogy. I like it. Yeah. Okay. Good.
And that's kind of where we are today. I don't think I would end it. In some ways, sometimes social media companies say we're like a utility. Well, if you're like a utility, then you ought to be subject to some regulation like a utility to prevent you from gouging consumers or withholding service from people who might need it. And so, some of the things I propose in the book are to have some, again, immunity from legal liability with some conditions. So, for example, you could be sued not for the content other people are putting on there, but if you, Facebook or others, are creating algorithms that are deliberately designed to engender outrage, because outrage means more engagement, and more engagement means you're on the platform longer, which in turn means higher advertising rates. So outrage equals money for Facebook. And if they are deliberately manipulating people by, putting the settings on the algorithms so that the things that pop up to the priorities in your content in your feed are all the things that will outrage you, well, maybe you can be held liable for that. That's your own conduct. Or there are a lot of different rules for advertising on social media versus advertising, political advertisements on television and radio. There's no requirement that you say, I'm Kamala Harris and I approve this ad on
Right.
the internet. And so you don't always know who is responsible for some of the ads that are online. So again, perhaps if the social media platform is collecting money in exchange for this ad, they ought to require disclosure of who paid for the ad. And if they fail to do so, they could be legally liable for that, which is
Hmm.
their own action. So I think it's things like that. Or if they scrape your private data and sell it to other people without your express consent, maybe they could be liable for that. If they allow bots to be on their platform and engaging in arguments with you or amplifying false claims, maybe they could be liable for that. If they fail to label content created with artificial intelligence,
Hmm.
maybe they could be liable for that. So that's where I would focus my regulatory attention as opposed to banning certain content.
So how much responsibility, Barbara, should listeners or consumers of information have to assure that what they're reading is accurate, what they're sharing, right, isn't false, and so
Yeah.
forth?
Yeah, I think a great deal. I don't want to blame the victims when you've got behemoths like, Facebook deliberately
Mhm.
manipulating us. But at the same time, I think in the same way we seek to build resilience against disease and protect ourselves from theft by criminals or other kinds of crimes, we ought to be helping our population build resilience against disinformation. And that's
Mhm.
by improving our own media literacy. I
Mhm.
think we should be teaching our kids in school good media literacy. In Finland, it's part of the curriculum because based on their proximity to Russia, they've been bombarded by disinformation for decades, and
Yeah.
it works. Students there learn to read a headline critically, to make sure you read the story and not just the headline, to confirm with a second source that what you're reading is true, to look for integrity in data studies, to look that for actual experts based on their background when they are cited in an article for their opinion. So there are a lot of things we can do, and even beyond children, I think educating adults through libraries, civic groups, faith
Mhm.
communities. There are a lot of places where we could provide good information to our citizens so that we can be armed to be skeptical about what we read.
We're chatting with Barbara McQuade, author of the book Attack from Within: How Disinformation is Sabotaging America, on KZSU-FM, Stanford, and Hearsay Culture. We've got about 10 minutes left, Barbara, so I want to ask you a few more things in this space of what we do. Frederick Schauer, the eminent First Amendment scholar at the University of Virginia, who was on Hearsay Culture years ago, has written about everything involved. First Amendment, really, and pretty much whenever I'm looking at these issues, I think, well, what has Fred Schauer said, and then I go from there. So he was interviewed by Virginia Law's online magazine a few years ago in an article in the spring 2020 entitled, which I think very clever title, "The Lies Have It. Is a time to rethink the marketplace and our tolerance for falsity." I want to quote Schauer, and who listeners may be familiar with, but who is truly brilliant on these issues. And I'm just going to read a quote. I want to get your reaction to it. He said the following. The article begins by saying, that whole marketplace of idea concept that says if you hear all arguments, the best will win out. This is the article. Well, it's a bunch of hooey, says the article. And here's the quote. Here's the quote from Schauer. "I have long been skeptical of the oft-touted but rarely analyzed virtues of public deliberation or public discourse as a route to truth, knowledge, sound public policy, etc. I'm also of the view that our current First Amendment theory and doctrine doesn't deal very well with verifiable, concrete fact." Okay, now we could spend the entire show on this, but I want to ask your reaction to both of these comments. First, how skeptical, or are you skeptical of, as Schauer points out, right, the power of public deliberation or public discourse, which again, in this context, right, we're talking about social media, right, and all the ways that we use to communicate with each other, right, as a route to truth, knowledge, sound policy. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea because I think this whole idea of the marketplace of ideas has long been considered, with favor by First Amendment scholars.
Right.
And Fred Schauer certainly is one of the most distinguished in our country. I think it's really interesting. I do think there's some value in the marketplace of ideas, though. But what I want, but I will agree with him in this regard. I think that, Elon Musk and others are fond of saying that, X or other platforms is today's the modern town square. It is the
Mhm.
digital town square. And I think that is false because in the town square, you can see who is speaking. And
Mhm.
online, it might very well be someone pretending to be someone they're not, right? It could be
Mhm.
someone using a pseudonym, as we saw when Russia created all kinds of false personas to look like ordinary Americans, when in fact it was, somebody in a boiler room in St. Petersburg typing
Right,
away.
right,
Um,
right.
so it's not quite perfect for the town square in that way. And the other thing is, in the town square, you can see the reactions of other people, right? You can see whether the speaker is being cheered or booed or shouted down or ignored.
Mhm.
And again, because of bots online, you can create this artificial popularity and make it look like your message has been liked and shared thousands or millions of times, but in fact they're bots controlled by the speaker.
Right.
And so they have really, like, pumped all of this into the town square
Mhm.
in a way that is very deceiving. And
Mhm.
so I'm not sure that is the way to persuade people, but I do think there is something to be said about public opinion, and the way certain ideas reach a tipping point in society. And I think much of that has to do with the mass media, social media. Like Black Lives Matter was a phrase that someone pushed on social media.
Right.
Uh, and then it became a phenomenon. And so I do think that we still do have the ability to shape public opinion with discourse. So I think I'll agree with him that social media is not a great replica of the marketplace of ideas,
Right.
but there still is some value in that sort of exchange of
Yep.
ideas in discourse among society.
And I added the social media patina to it, but I think that's kind of what, we could think about here, in terms of where public deliberation and public discourse happens. What about that second part, right? Which is to put it simply, right, that the First Amendment doesn't, theory and doctrine doesn't deal very well with verifiable concrete facts.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think the point of the First Amendment really is to express ideas and opinions.
Yeah.
The government should do this, the government should not do that, calling out government misconduct and those kinds of things. But if you just want to say that blue is red,
Yeah.
that
Right.
that's not actionable.
Yeah.
You're
Right.
entitled to say those kinds of things. Now, one would hope that in a society that people care enough about truth, that if I say blue is red, that 10 other people will come out and say, no, red is red. And
Mhm.
that ultimately, I will be cast aside or discredited because of that. But it does allow us to engage in lies.
Mhm.
And, for better or for worse. Now, again, not everywhere. You can't commit perjury. You can't, as an officer of the court, you can't say it in a courtroom in front of a judge. But I think Corey Lewandowski, who was a campaign manager for Donald Trump, said, "I have no obligation to be truthful with the media,"
Mhm.
uh, and that is true. And so I guess it leaves it to others who care about truth to discredit those who traffic in lies. But I think Professor Schauer is correct that the First Amendment does not prevent us and permits us to engage in lies.
Well, yeah, and that's actually that last point is what I wanted to say, right? And push on a little bit because you said it right. It's not as much that you can't perjure yourself as much as if you perjure yourself, there's a price to be paid, right? In other
Yes.
words, I mean,
Oh,
as
that's right.
right? I mean, you have, I mean, I teach contracts, right? You can lie all you want, right?
Sure.
In a transaction,
It's a
just
consequence.
there's just there are consequences. You may
Sure.
not have a contract. You may be sued for damages and so forth, right? All of that, is the information asymmetry that exists in society, and
Yeah.
and it makes me think in the remaining time we have, right? We're recording on August 26th, 2024, right? We have a, obviously another massively consequential election coming up in just a few months. As you sit here today, Barbara, and I don't do crystal ball questions. I want to tell you that up front. I'm not going to ask you what's going to happen in the future, but I'm asking right now, as you think about where we are now, what concerns you the most as we head into, right? And obviously it's truncated and it's rapid with the change in the Democratic Party candidate and so forth. What concerns you the most right now from an attack from within perspective?
Yeah, I'm very concerned about political violence. I
Mhm.
think that when we've got people undermining critics, to include the press, law enforcement, and the courts. People have lost trust in those institutions to protect us, and so feel a need to take the law into their own hands. I think the assassination attempt against Donald Trump was deeply troubling. We talked about the attack on Nancy Pelosi. We are hearing about all kinds of swatting incidents. Our
Yeah,
Secretary of State here in Michigan was swatted twice last week.
right.
I worry about those kinds of attacks on our public officials because, number one, somebody's going to get hurt. But number two, I worry that it causes good people to not seek public office
Yeah,
or to leave public office. And maybe we don't see that at the highest levels, but there are statistics that at the lowest levels, that is very much true. People who are local election officials, health officials, school board officials are saying, no, thanks. I
right.
don't need people to be coming after me based on false claims that get spun out of control for low pay, overwork, and now to be harassed. So I worry very much about that, and that I think that unless we, make truth a prerequisite to being a responsible society member of society, to be a patriot means a fidelity to the truth. I think that if we can push ourselves to that commitment, perhaps we can alleviate some of these concerns that I have about political violence.
Which ties to another point that you make, which I think is incredibly important. You talk about the failure of both political parties in American history of not exercising forbearance, right? The option to not do something or to forbear, right? And Shannon Valor, you can see a theme here. Had a show about a month ago on her book, The AI Mirror. And what she talks about, which I think is related in the context of regulating AI, is the virtue of prudence, right? Which is not the same as forbearance, but it's the same, I think, broadly idea, right? Of withholding action, right? Of being careful. And the lack of forbearance, as you've already alluded in this interview, seems quite stark right now, doesn't it?
Yeah, it really does. In fact, I read a headline today that really brought this home. For many months, Republicans in Congress have been investigating Joe Biden for, connections to China and impeachment. Now suddenly they're going after Kamala Harris. All right. I
Right,
mean,
right,
if we're
right,
really
right.
concerned about misconduct, it should be, I'm concerned about the conduct, and then I interview the person. But now that there's a change in candidates, suddenly there's a change in who's under investigation. And it really does suggest, and the accusation that it is those executive branch officials who are weaponizing government, when in fact, I think, some of those who are investigating the investigators may be weaponizing their powers for a partisan angle. And so I think that forbearance is a very important part of it. Look, the party in power gets to set priorities. Republicans have the House at the moment, and they should be setting legislative priorities, immigration, whatever it is they think is important. But the idea that they use all of their energy to go after the other party, or when you see the Supreme Court, just because it can, overturning decades of precedent, that lack of forbearance, I think, very much undermines credibility for the government in our institutions and does a lot of harm to them. And so, certainly there are appropriate uses of power when people have them, but attacking your opponent just because you can strikes me as an abuse of that power.
So, Barbara, last question. We're both law professors. You're making I'm sure you make charges to your class, and you want to encourage your classes as I do. I've referred to the law frankly, since the election of the former president. I've referred to lawyers as the bulwark against chaos. And I'm curious what your charge is. If you had 30 seconds to your law students in the face of all of these concerns, what do you say to them?
Yeah, I usually tell them, don't just practice law, seek justice.
Yeah, right.
They're not necessarily the same thing.
Right, right. Barbara McQuade, yeah, that's exactly right. Barbara McQuade, author of the book Attack from Within: How Disinformation is Sabotaging America. Thank you so much for joining me on the Hearsay Culture Network and on KZSU-FM Stanford. Outstanding book, highly recommended, and I look forward to further discussions down the road.
Thanks, Steve.
Hearsay Culture is on the Hearsay Culture Network. You can find more about our shows, including my show with my co-host Denise Howell, R&D with D&D, Denise's show Uneven Distribution, my show Secrets, and more that we offer for our listeners by going to hearsayculture.com. But for now, thank you for listening to KZSU and Stanford Radio and Hearsay Culture Radio. Stay tuned for more diverse programming and have a terrific day.